Hi again, it's Herman from Gadfly Academy. This is my first attempt at a new format, as you have probably already noticed. I am, alas, going to be losing my editor Bella soon, at least for a while. So I'm experimenting with other formats so I can continue to offer weekly videos. I've seen this work for other YouTubers that I respect, so we'll see how it goes. I should mention, too, that it's likely that you'll actually be seeing more of me rather than less of me soon, as I hope to experiment with another less formal video format. This is all definitely a work in progress, but rest assured I am here for the long haul, so stay tuned. Thanks also for your patience these past couple of weeks as we took a break from our book study. In today's video, I'm discussing Chapter 4 of Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death, which is entitled The Typographic Mind. And in particular, I'm going to look at the question of the kind of internal world that is cultivated by typographic culture and how this differs from that which is cultivated by visual culture. Postman's description of the Lincoln-Douglas debates at the beginning of Chapter 4, and especially of the milieu in which they took place, is certainly remarkable for its description of a literate culture that had the capacity to not only listen to debates for hours on end, but also to appreciate the subtleties of the arguments being made. This capacity of everyday Americans to listen for extended periods of time to these kinds of conversations shows how far we have fallen as a culture and as a people. This is, of course, Postman's point. With the decline of typographic culture, human attention spans have greatly decreased, along with our tolerance for nuance and more complicated language and argument. Humans have always had a tendency to gravitate to the simple solution and the easiest path forward, so it shouldn't really come as a surprise that this is the path that we have taken. Technological development and solutions have, of course, drastically increased this process. I'm quite sure that Postman would have not been surprised by the TikTokization of our culture, and that he would also certainly have lamented it. One of the great problems, as I see it, is that this movement is one towards an ever-increasing externality. Rather than cultivating one's inner world, one is constantly drawn outward in search of new experiences rather than inward and into the cultivation of one's inner person. The less one cultivates one inner person, the less developed one becomes as a unique person. And the less one comes to know oneself, the less comfortable one is in one's own skin. Finally, when one's focus is constantly outward, there's a kind of homogenization within society that takes place. I'd like to spend the rest of this installment looking more specifically at the kind of inner world that typographic culture cultivates and how this differs from what visual culture cultivates. So here's a quote from Neil Postman. I do not mean to imply that prior to the written word, analytic thought was not possible. I am referring here not to the potentialities of the individual mind, but to the predispositions of a cultural mindset. In a culture dominated by print, public discourse tends to be characterized by a coherent, orderly arrangement of facts and ideas. The public for whom it is intended is generally competent to manage such discourse. That's from page 51. So, what does the inner world of typographic culture look like? Ultimately, typographic culture is defined by the written word and the printed text, of course. While there are two main stages of typographic culture, the writing of a text and then the reading of a text, both of these parts of the process require similar inner states. So, I've got a kind of a list here of the aspects of writing and reading that are cultivated in this process. So one thing that both writing and reading require is active interpretation, linear thinking, and logical analysis. Public discourse in such a culture, especially in politics, religion, education, and journalism, tends to be reasoned and evidence-based. They also emphasize depth and context. Because written arguments unfold over time, print encourages sustained attention, critical thinking, and contextual understanding. They both favor abstract thought. The process of reading print often detaches the context from immediate visual cues, and it thus demands the reader's imagination and abstract reasoning. This process also requires that one keep a critical distance. Words can be weighed, debated, and interrogated. They both foster self-analysis and internal dialogue, which often lead to a coherent sense of the self over time. They both foster the psychological habit of a fixed point of view and a sense of some kind of objective knowledge. They both restructure the mind to think in terms of categories, lists, hierarchies, and logic. And finally, both writing and reading have been used historically to cultivate an inner life of contemplation and reverence, especially in the monastic tradition. This process has the capacity to foster moral response to reflections on suffering, etc. This inner world that's cultivated by typographic culture can be compared and contrasted with the inner world as cultivated by visual culture, which does not really cultivate the inner world very much. It's defined by the visual image, whether static or moving. And both static and moving images cultivate a culture that emphasizes immediate emotional impact, response over reasoned discourse. It's important to note that this bypassing of the rational faculties makes citizens more susceptible to propaganda and also certainly to being sold things. So it's very good for marketing and advertising. Visual culture also favors fragmentation and entertainment. So television and TikTok thrive on short, decontextualized segments designed to entertain rather than to inform. Also, information becomes disjointed and less about meaning and more about sensation, and thus undermines, again, serious public discourse. Visual culture encourages passivity. Unlike reading, watching television is a passive activity, and it conditions viewers to expect quick gratification rather than patient reflection. Visual culture creates a global village of immediacy, simultaneity, and emotional reaction. It reverts aspects of our consciousness towards orality, favoring performance, emotion, and context over abstract analysis. And in one sense, this was less of a problem in the oral age. In the visual age, this process, it doesn't offer the virtues of the oral culture. In particular, in an oral culture, you have a communal filter for filtering out bad information, as well as providing a context within which a given piece of information makes sense. And finally, visual culture accelerates noise, it shortens attention spans, and it undermines the spiritual dimension of the self. Information glut often results in empathy fatigue and emotional passivity as we're unable to properly respond to or address the tragedies that we see on a daily basis. Many people have pointed out that modern Western culture is going through a mental health crisis. And it's hard to believe that this crisis is unrelated to the shift from a typographic to a visual culture. Certainly, there are many different sources of this crisis, but this must be considered to be an important one. Mental health requires a stable sense of oneself, which in turn requires a healthy and deepening self-awareness. Typographic culture lends itself to this process, whereas visual culture actively undermines it. Finally, it's worth noting that while oral culture would have not generally provided people with this capacity for introspection, one's sense of oneself would have been much more profoundly shaped by the intense community life that most people enjoyed prior to the typographic age. In the individualistic world created by typography, the burden of understanding oneself lies nearly completely on the shoulders of each individual. Those are my thoughts on Chapter 4 of Neil Postman's book. We will continue looking at amusing ourselves to death next week with Chapter 5. As always, if you have not already, please subscribe to the newsletter and download the How Did We Get Here reading list. There's a link below the video, as always. Hope you're finding the book interesting and thought-provoking, and I look forward to continuing to go through it with you. If you haven't already, please also go over to the Substack where you can read this as well as engage in the comment section with any thoughts or reflections that you'd like to share. So take care, and we'll see you soon.